The wind coming off the Bosporus carried the smell of salt and smoke long before anyone saw the enemy fleet. It was the summer of 672. The walls of Constantinople stood silent in the darkness, their massive stones still holding the heat of the day. On the sea below, lanterns began to appear, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. An armada moving in slow formation, oars dipping into black water in perfect rhythm. The Arab fleet had come again, and this time their numbers seemed endless. From the walls, the defenders could see it clearly, ship after ship emerging from the night, sails furled, hulls cutting through the current. There were too many to count, but the estimates passed quietly among the soldiers. 200 vessels, perhaps more. 5 attackers for every defender, maybe 10. Men tightened their grips on spears and bows, but everyone understood the truth. If the fleet reached the harbor walls intact, the city would fall, and if Constantinople fell, the empire would fall with it. Then, from the harbor's inner edge, small vessels began to move. They were low, narrow ships, nothing impressive to look at. But mounted at their bows were strange bronze tubes, angled forward like the snouts of beasts. Inside the tubes, crews worked in silence, pumping handles, turning valves, feeding some unknown substance into hidden chambers. At first, nothing happened. Then a sound broke the night, a deep, hollow roar, like a furnace opening. A stream of fire shot across the water. It did not arc like a flaming arrow. It did not flicker like burning oil. It surged forward in a continuous jet, bright as lightning, striking the nearest ship with a force that made the hull shudder. Flames spread instantly. Not floating flames, not drifting embers. The fire clung to wood, to rope, to flesh. It crawled across decks and down the sides of ships, spilling onto the water itself, and the water burned. Sailors screamed. Some leapt overboard, only to find the sea around them alive with fire, the surface glowing like molten glass. Oars snapped, rigging ignited. Entire vessels became floating torches, drifting helplessly into one another as panic tore through the fleet. From the walls, the defenders watched in stunned silence. Even they had never seen it unleashed at this scale. By dawn, the sea was littered with blackened wreckage. The armada that had seemed unstoppable hours before was gone. What saved Constantinople that night was not numbers or strategy. It was a weapon the world would never fully understand. Historians later called it Greek fire, but that name explains nothing. The formula was guarded more closely than any crown jewel. Workshops were hidden, craftsmen sworn to secrecy under threat of death, and instructions passed only within a narrow circle tied directly to the imperial court. For centuries, the weapon remained the empire's most powerful defense. Fleets that approached the city knew the risk. Some turned back rather than face it. And yet, for all its fame, no complete description of Greek fire survives. Chroniclers wrote of fire that could not be extinguished with water, of flames that clung to surfaces, of streams projected through siphons under pressure. But the precise mixture, the exact preparation, the method of ignition, those details vanished. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the secret disappeared with it. Modern chemists have proposed theories: petroleum derivatives, quicklime, sulfur, resins, combinations that burn fiercely and resist water. Reconstructions have produced terrifying weapons, but none match every historical account. No mixture perfectly explains the reports of flames continuing beneath the surface, or the extraordinary stability required to project liquid fire from pressurized bronze tubes aboard moving ships. Perhaps the Byzantines discovered something through experimentation that was never written down, only practiced, a method learned through repetition, passed from master to apprentice, refined across generations, and then broken in a single moment of history. What is certain is this: for 700 years, no enemy succeeded in duplicating it. Not the Arabs, who had access to oil seeps and skilled chemists. Not the Venetians, masters of naval engineering. Not the Genoese, who traded in every secret worth buying. An empire guarded a technology so effectively that when it vanished completely. And Greek fire was only the beginning. Far to the north, centuries later, another mystery was being buried with the dead. The grave was shallow, carved into frozen soil somewhere in Scandinavia. When archaeologists uncovered it more than 1,000 years later, they expected the usual discoveries: fragments of bone, rusted iron, remnants of leather. Instead, they found a sword. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Straight blade, simple crossguard, a weapon like thousands of others from the Viking Age. But when the dirt was brushed away, letters emerged along the blade. Ulfberht Plus. The inscription was unmistakable, and so was the steel. When metallurgists examined surviving examples of these swords in the 20th century, they found something impossible. The metal was extraordinarily pure, with carbon content far higher than typical medieval iron. The internal structure revealed a form of crucible steel, a material requiring controlled furnace temperatures and techniques that Europe would not master for many centuries. These were not crude weapons hammered from bloomery iron. They were precision-made blades, forged from steel of a quality that rivaled products of the early industrial era. More than 170 such swords have been found, scattered from Norway to the rivers of Eastern Europe, enough to suggest that thousands once existed. But where were they made? One theory points eastward. Trade routes linked Viking territories to the Middle East and beyond, where high-quality crucible steel, known today as Hwacha, was already being produced. Perhaps ingots were imported, reforged, and stamped with the Ulfberht name as a mark of quality. It is a plausible explanation, but it leaves questions. Why does the inscription appear only in Northern Europe? Why are there no records of the name in the regions where the steel might have originated? And if the blades were simply imported and reshaped, why do we find no gradual improvement in European metallurgy, no transitional forms showing experimentation or learning? Instead, the technology appears suddenly, fully developed, and then disappears just as suddenly. Later swords bearing similar inscriptions exist, but their steel is inferior. Counterfeits, perhaps, produced after the original source of high-quality material was lost. Who or what was Ulfberht? A master smith, a workshop, a brand centuries ahead of its time, or a name attached to a supply chain that no longer existed? The swords offer no answers, only evidence. And evidence can be unsettling because it challenges the story we like to tell about the past, that progress moves in a straight line, that technology steadily improves, that earlier societies were always less capable than our own. History, however, rarely moves in straight lines. Sometimes knowledge appears, flourishes, and disappears so completely that later generations can only guess how it was achieved. And sometimes what vanishes is not just a technique, but an entire way of understanding the world. To understand how fragile knowledge can be, you only need to look at what happened to another legendary material, one that once defined the finest blades on Earth. A steel so beautiful that its surface seemed alive. A steel whose secret died in silence, and whose echoes still puzzle scientists today. In the markets of the medieval Middle East, there were blades that merchants did not display openly. They were wrapped in cloth, brought out only for serious buyers, and handled with a kind of quiet reverence. When the fabric was finally unrolled, the steel beneath caught the light in a way that seemed almost unnatural. Patterns rippled across the blade, waves, swirls, flowing lines like water frozen in motion. These were Damascus blades. To the warriors who carried them, they were more than weapons. They were objects of near-mythic reputation, stories spread across continents, swords that could cut through lesser steel, blades that stayed sharp through countless battles, weapons that could bend without breaking and return perfectly straight. Exaggeration often follows fame, but when modern metallurgists began studying surviving examples, they found that the legends were not entirely fiction. Under microscopes, the steel revealed a complex internal structure. Unlike ordinary iron, bands of carbides formed microscopic patterns that gave the blades both strength and flexibility. Some analyses even revealed structures at the nanoscale, formations that modern laboratories struggled to reproduce consistently. And yet these blades were made centuries before anyone understood the science behind them. The origin of Damascus steel lay far from Damascus itself. The raw material came from India, where crucible steel, known as Hwacha, had been produced for over 1,000 years. Small ingots were transported west along trade routes, eventually reaching smiths in the Middle East, who discovered that, under very specific forging conditions, the steel produced the distinctive flowing patterns. The process was unforgiving. Heat the metal too much, and the structure vanished. Hammer it incorrectly, and the blade lost its strength. Even slight variations in temperature or timing could ruin weeks of work. Smiths learned not through equations or textbooks, but through observation, watching color changes in glowing metal, listening to the sound of hammer strikes, judging temperature by instinct refined over years of experience. It was knowledge that lived in hands and memory, not in writing. And then, sometime in the 18th century, the tradition ended. No single event marked its disappearance. No decree outlawed the craft. The blades simply stopped appearing. One explanation points to the mines in India that supplied the original Wootz steel. Trace elements in the ore, vanadium, chromium, and others may have played a critical role in forming the microscopic structures that gave Damascus blades their unique properties. When those particular ore sources were exhausted or abandoned, the raw material itself changed, and the results could no longer be reproduced. But that explanation raises its own questions. If the secret lay in the ore, why did smiths not experiment with new sources? Why did the technique vanish so completely that even experienced metalworkers could not recreate it for centuries? It suggests that what was lost was not only a material, but a tradition, a chain of knowledge passed from master to apprentice that, once broken, could not easily be rebuilt. A blade can survive for 1,000 years. A method can vanish in a generation. Long before Damascus steel reached its peak, another blade was being crafted under very different circumstances, in a world that had not yet entered the Iron Age. In the Valley of the Kings, deep in the Egyptian desert, archaeologists uncovered the tomb of a young ruler who had died more than 3,000 years earlier. Among the treasures surrounding the body, gold ornaments, ceremonial objects, chariots, there was a dagger resting beside the mummy. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable compared to the other riches. The blade was iron, the hilt gold, the workmanship fine but not extravagant. But iron itself was rare in Egypt at that time, so rare that it was sometimes considered more precious than gold. Smelting iron from ore was still a developing technology, poorly understood and difficult to control. For decades, the dagger remained an interesting curiosity. Then, nearly a century after its discovery, scientists analyzed the metal using modern instruments. The results were unexpected. The iron contained high levels of nickel and cobalt, elements rarely found in terrestrial iron, but common in meteorites. The blade had not been forged from metal mined from the earth. It had been made from iron that fell from the sky. Ancient Egyptians referred to such material as iron of heaven. They collected meteorites from the desert, recognizing that this strange metal behaved differently from any other. It could be shaped, polished, and hardened in ways that ordinary iron could not. Working meteoric iron is difficult even for modern smiths. The metal contains irregular structures that can cause fractures during forging. Heat it too much, and it becomes brittle. Work it too cold, and it resists shaping. Yet the dagger buried with the young pharaoh shows none of these flaws. Its blade is smooth, balanced, and remarkably well preserved. Who taught the craftsmen how to shape such material? How many meteorites did they experiment with before mastering the technique? And how did they understand, without modern tools, that the metal required different treatment from ordinary iron? Some historians believe the knowledge may have come through contact with neighboring cultures that had begun experimenting with early ironworking. Others think the Egyptians themselves learned through patient trial and error, guided by careful observation. Either way, the dagger represents something profound, not just skill, but adaptability. The ability to recognize that a material behaves differently and to develop entirely new methods to work with it. It is easy to underestimate ancient craftsmen, to imagine them limited by the absence of modern science. But science itself often begins with observation, long before theories are written. And sometimes observation alone is enough to achieve extraordinary results. Across the ocean, in a world the Egyptians would never know existed, another material was being shaped into weapons of terrifying effectiveness. Obsidian. To the untrained eye, it looks like glass. Black, glossy, brittle. Hardly the substance one would choose for a weapon. But obsidian fractures in a way unlike any other material. When struck correctly, it forms edges only a few nanometers thick, far sharper than the finest steel blade. In Mesoamerica, craftsmen perfected the art of shaping obsidian into razor-sharp blades. These were set into wooden frames to create weapons known as macuahuitl, broad, flat clubs edged with rows of black glass. Spanish chroniclers who first encountered these weapons were stunned by their effectiveness. One account describes a single blow severing the head of a horse, an animal the Aztecs had never seen before and whose strength and speed had seemed unstoppable. Steel armor offered some protection, but the cutting power of obsidian was unlike anything European soldiers had faced. The edges dulled quickly and could shatter under heavy impact, but they were easily replaced. The weapon was designed not for durability, but for devastating sharpness. The engineering behind it was subtle. The wooden core absorbed shock, preventing the brittle obsidian from breaking too easily. The spacing and angle of the blades maximized cutting efficiency while maintaining structural integrity. This was not a crude invention. It was the result of generations of experimentation, refinement, and practical knowledge of materials. And yet, like so many other technologies, it vanished. When the civilizations that produced these weapons were destroyed, the knowledge faded with them. Surviving examples are rare. The wooden components long decayed, leaving only scattered fragments of obsidian to hint at what once existed. 3 different materials, 3 different cultures, 3 different times, steel patterned like flowing water, iron forged from fallen stars, glass sharp enough to sever flesh with a single stroke. Each represents a level of understanding that challenges assumptions about the past, not because ancient craftsmen possessed modern scientific knowledge, but because they achieved remarkable results without it. And if such knowledge could appear, flourish, and disappear so completely, what else might have been lost? There are weapons that burned on water, blades whose secrets died with their makers, techniques rediscovered only centuries later. And there are others, devices so unusual that even today, historians debate whether they were real at all. One of them was said to turn sunlight into fire. The Romans had crushed cities that thought they were untouchable. They had taken fortified ports, burned fleets, starved defenders behind walls until hunger did the work that swords could not. So when their ships approached Syracuse in the 3rd century BC, the mood in the Roman ranks was not fear, it was routine. Syracuse was rich, Syracuse was proud, Syracuse would fall. But then the harbor began to feel wrong. Not an ambush wrong, no arrows raining down, no sudden charge from hidden boats. It was quieter than that, unnervingly quiet. The kind of quiet that makes disciplined soldiers start looking at each other. And then, according to later accounts, the first ship caught fire, not from flaming pitch, not from a catapult stone cracking a deck. The reports say it happened as if the sun itself had decided to punish the fleet. A bright glare from the walls, a sudden heat, and then smoke, then flame. The story became one of the most famous, impossible weapons in history. Archimedes' mirrors, a line of polished surfaces arranged to focus sunlight into a burning point on enemy ships. Most modern historians dismiss it as legend, a tale invented centuries later, attached to a man who really did build terrifying machines. The claw that could lift ships, catapults calibrated for different ranges, defensive systems so clever that Rome, for a time, hesitated. But the mirror story refuses to die, because it has a strange property that myths usually don't have. It sometimes works. When modern experimenters tried to replicate the idea, they found that under perfect conditions, clear sky, bright sunlight, stationary target, well-aimed reflective surfaces, wood can ignite. Not instantly, not like a movie, but slowly, then suddenly, a smolder, a curl of smoke, and then a flame that spreads across dry planks. That changes the argument. If it can work, even occasionally, the question shifts. Not, is it possible, but what was it for? Because warfare is not only physics, it is psychology. A Roman sailor who sees a ship ignite without understanding why doesn't care about focal lengths. He cares that something invisible is burning him alive. He cares that the walls of Syracuse appear to command the sun. Even a limited success could cause panic. Panic spreads faster than fire. And Archimedes understood panic. He understood leverage. He understood the difference between killing an enemy and breaking an enemy. So imagine a different version of the story, less cinematic, more plausible. Perhaps the mirrors were not a primary defense, but an experiment, a demonstration. A weapon used at one dramatic moment, when the sun was right and the ships were close enough. A rare trick, memorable precisely because it was rare. The kind of thing that would be talked about for centuries. If so, the mirrors were not meant to win the siege on their own. They were meant to create hesitation, confusion, fear. Sometimes that is enough. From light, we move to something older than steel, older than empires, an invention so effective that it conquered 3 continents and remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. The composite bow. Picture the steppe, wide open land where distance is everything, where armies are not lines of infantry but waves of riders, where survival depends on speed and the ability to kill from far away without slowing down. A longbow is powerful, but it is tall, awkward, and unforgiving on horseback. A simple wooden bow can be made quickly, but it cannot store enough energy to pierce armor at long range. The composite bow solved both problems with an idea that feels almost too elegant. 3 materials, 1 weapon. Wood at the core, providing shape. Horn on the belly, the side facing the archer, built to handle compression. Sinew on the back, the side facing the target, built to handle tension. Each material placed exactly where it performs best. The result is a bow that is short enough for horseback but powerful enough to punch through armor. A weapon that can be drawn and fired in motion, repeatedly, with deadly accuracy. And here's the unsettling part. Across vast distances and thousands of years, the design remains remarkably consistent. Scythians, Parthians, Huns, Turks, Mongols, Persians, different languages, different gods, different cultures, but the bow's construction principles repeat with almost ritual precision. Even the details echo: the recurved shape, the stiff tips, the glue recipes, the long curing times, the careful protection from moisture. Why? Parallel innovation can explain similarities, but it usually produces variation, regional tweaks, different sequences, alternative materials. You expect experimentation. Instead, the composite bow appears in history like a perfected blueprint, spreading across the world and resisting change. That suggests something else, a tradition so strict that deviation was punished by failure. Make the glue wrong and the bow delaminates. Cure it too fast and it warps. Get the sinew placement wrong and it snaps in your hands. In other words, the bow teaches you obedience. It forces you to respect the method, and that could explain its uniformity. It wasn't standardized by a central empire, but by physics itself. The materials demanded a specific arrangement, and every failed attempt reinforced the same lesson. But it still leaves a lingering question. Where is the evidence of the learning phase? Thousands of years of bow making should leave behind countless broken prototypes, imperfect transitions, half-successful variations. Yet the archaeological record often shows mature designs without the messy steps in between. Sometimes the failures are simply invisible. Wood and sinew rot. Glue dissolves. The mistakes disappear. And so history preserves the finished product and erases the struggle, which creates a haunting illusion. Knowledge appearing fully formed. Now step forward in time again, to a place where skill was not only about killing your enemy, but about surviving your own weapon. Kerala, southern India. A student stands in a training yard, sweating in the heat, surrounded by instructors who have spent decades mastering their craft. In his hands is something that does not look like a sword. At rest, it is a coil, a belt of steel. Then he moves, and the coil becomes a blur. The Urumi is a flexible blade, spring-tempered, capable of whipping around shields and wrapping around limbs. It cuts when it tightens. It strikes from angles the eye cannot track. It is devastating, but it is also unforgiving. A rigid sword is dangerous, but predictable. A flexible blade is chaos. If your timing is wrong by a fraction, the weapon returns to you. If your stance is unstable, it coils around your body. If your speed falters, it can bite the hand that holds it. That is why traditional systems treat it as a final weapon, something taught only after years of mastering everything else. Not because it is flashy, but because it is genuinely lethal to amateurs. And like so many other technologies in this story, it contains a quiet mystery. Spring steel requires precise control, carbon content, heating, quenching, tempering cycles that create a blade able to bend repeatedly without fatigue while still holding a cutting edge. Europe struggled with reliable spring steel until relatively late, yet here it was, embodied in a weapon that demands flexibility as its defining feature. How did the smiths achieve that balance? Perhaps the answer is simple. Southern India had deep metallurgical traditions, including early high-carbon steels. Perhaps the Urumi emerged from that ecosystem naturally. But then, why did it not spread? Flexible weapons exist elsewhere. Chain whips, flails, segmented staffs, but none combine whip behavior with a sharpened steel edge in quite the same way. The Urumi remained regional, protected within lineages, hidden behind skill and danger. A weapon too difficult to copy casually, too hazardous to popularize. In a way, it guarded itself. Light that can burn wood. A bow that remained unchanged for millennia. A sword that moves like a living thing. Three very different impossibilities, all connected by a common thread. Knowledge preserved not by written instructions, but by tradition, discipline, and fear. Fear of failure, fear of death, fear of losing something valuable. And yet even traditions can break. Because the next weapon in this chain was not guarded by secrecy alone. It was guarded by scale, a weapon that did not rely on one blade or one archer, but on a terrifying idea. If you can't aim perfectly, overwhelm the sky itself. A weapon that could launch hundreds of projectiles in a single breath. And it did it centuries before the world expected such a thing. The soldiers advancing toward the fortress believed the battle was already decided. It was 1593, during the Japanese invasions of Korea. The invading army had pushed deep into the peninsula, winning engagement after engagement. Fortresses had fallen, cities had been abandoned. The momentum of victory creates a dangerous confidence, and by that stage of the campaign, many soldiers marched with exactly that, confidence. Ahead of them stood the walls of Hangzhou. Inside were only a few thousand defenders. Outside, tens of thousands of attackers prepared to advance. On paper, the outcome seemed inevitable. Then the defenders rolled out strange wooden carts. At first glance, they looked like simple frames mounted on wheels, angled slightly upward, but the front of each cart was covered in rows of narrow tubes, dozens upon dozens of them, each loaded with what appeared to be arrows. A signal was given, and then the sky filled with fire. Hundreds of rockets erupted at once, screaming across the air in a storm of smoke and sparks. They struck in clusters, igniting shields, clothing, banners, anything flammable. The sound alone was enough to shatter formation. A roar, a hiss, a rain of burning projectiles falling faster than men could react. Then it happened again and again. This weapon was called the Hwacha, and it represented something warfare had rarely seen before. True saturation fire. Not accuracy, not precision, but overwhelming volume. A single cart could unleash a storm that covered an entire section of battlefield. Modern observers sometimes underestimate how terrifying this would have been. Gunpowder weapons were not new in East Asia, but the scale and coordination of the Hwacha transformed them into something closer to artillery. The engineering behind it was deceptively simple. Rockets, known as singijan, were loaded into guide tubes arranged in a grid. Each rocket carried its own propellant and stabilizing shaft, turning what looked like an arrow into a small missile. A trained crew could prepare and fire volleys in rapid succession, maintaining a nearly continuous barrage. It was not perfect. Accuracy was limited, and weather could interfere. But against massed troops, precision was unnecessary. The weapon's true power lay in psychology, noise, flame, unpredictability, elements that break cohesion faster than casualties alone. Centuries later, when armies developed rocket artillery and multiple launch systems, the principle would be the same: overwhelm, disorient, terrify. But here it was in the 15th century, built from wood, bamboo, and powder. The design required careful balancing of weight and recoil, consistent propellant loads, and enough structural strength to withstand repeated firing without igniting the frame itself. It was not a crude invention. It was the result of disciplined engineering and careful testing. And yet, outside East Asia, nothing quite like it appeared for hundreds of years. The idea existed. The materials existed. Gunpowder existed. But the specific combination, the decision to mount hundreds of rockets in a single coordinated launcher, remained rare. Sometimes innovation is not about discovering something new. Sometimes it is about seeing how existing pieces can fit together in a way no one else has imagined. Not all revolutionary weapons relied on fire and smoke. Some depended on quiet mechanical ingenuity. Imagine standing in a defensive position on a Chinese battlefield 2,000 years ago. The air is thick with tension, and the enemy is advancing steadily. Archers around you draw and release in measured rhythm, each shot requiring strength, coordination, and time. But beside them stands a different kind of weapon. A soldier grips a wooden frame fitted with a lever. On top of it sits a rectangular box filled with bolts. He pushes the lever forward and pulls it back. A bolt flies. He does it again and again. The repeating crossbow, known as the Chu-ko-nu, sacrificed range and power for speed. It was not meant to penetrate heavy armor or strike distant targets. Its purpose was suppression, a rapid stream of projectiles that could disrupt charges and overwhelm lightly protected troops. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. A single motion both cocked the bowstring and fed a new bolt into place. Gravity assisted the magazine, allowing continuous fire until the box was empty. The design required precision carpentry, consistent components, and careful balancing of tension and friction. Too much resistance, and the lever would jam. Too little, and the string would not draw properly. What is remarkable is not merely that the weapon existed, but how long it endured. Variations of the repeating crossbow remained in use for centuries, long enough to witness the arrival of firearms, and even longer in some regions. 2,000 years is a long lifespan for any technology, especially in warfare, where obsolescence often arrives quickly. The repeating crossbow survived because it filled a specific role. Easy to use, reliable, effective at close range, and manufacturable in large numbers. It was not the most powerful weapon on the battlefield, but it did not need to be. Sometimes survival in history belongs not to the most advanced design, but to the one that fits its purpose perfectly. Now imagine another battlefield, centuries earlier, but far to the west. A Roman soldier faces an enemy who does not carry a sword or spear in the usual sense. Instead, the weapon in the warrior's hands looks like a club, edged with black stone. When it strikes, the effect is devastating. The obsidian blades embedded along its sides slice with a sharpness that steel struggles to match. Flesh parts cleanly, armor is scored and weakened. Horses, unused to such wounds, panic and collapse. We have already seen how obsidian can produce edges sharper than surgical instruments. But the true sophistication of weapons like the Makuahwaital lay in their design. The wooden body absorbed shock. The stone blades were replaceable. The spacing allowed each fragment to cut efficiently without shattering the entire edge. It was not a primitive substitute for metal. It was a solution tailored to available materials, optimized through generations of use. And like many such solutions, it disappeared when the society that depended on it was destroyed. Weapons do not exist in isolation. They belong to cultures, to economies, to traditions of training and manufacture. When those vanish, the technology often vanishes with them, not because it cannot be rebuilt, but because no one remains who needs it. If there is a single thread connecting all these stories, it is this: innovation does not follow a single path. Some weapons are born from theory and experimentation. Others emerge slowly, shaped by trial and error across centuries. Some spread across continents. Others remain isolated, protected by geography, tradition, or sheer difficulty. And sometimes, the most powerful technologies are not the ones that last forever, but the ones that leave behind only questions. Because there are still mysteries left in this journey. Mysteries of materials, of skill, of knowledge that seems to appear suddenly and vanish just as suddenly. And to understand them, we have to step back from individual weapons and look at the pattern they form together. If you walk through a museum, the past can seem quiet. Weapons lie behind glass, labels reduce centuries to a few lines of text, dates, materials, locations, iron, bronze, wood, leather. Everything feels distant, controlled, almost harmless. But those objects were not made for display. They were made for survival, for fear, for moments when entire civilizations stood on the edge of collapse. And when you look closely, something begins to emerge, not a single mystery, but a pattern. Greek fire guarded an empire for centuries and then vanished. Damascus blades defined the pinnacle of metallurgy and then disappeared. Ulfberht swords appeared suddenly, reached extraordinary quality, and faded away. The Urumi survived only in isolated traditions. The Hwacha, devastating in its time, became a historical curiosity. The repeating crossbow endured for 2 millennia, then quietly left the battlefield as new weapons replaced it. These are not isolated stories. They are variations of the same story. Knowledge is fragile. We like to imagine that once humanity discovers something, it is never truly lost. That progress accumulates, layer upon layer, until the past becomes irrelevant. But history tells a different story. Libraries burn, workshops close, masters die without apprentices, trade routes collapse, empires fall, and with them disappear the networks that made specialized materials and skills possible. A technology is not just an idea, it is a chain. Materials, craftsmen, tools, traditions, and the need that keeps all of it alive. Break any link, and the chain fails. That is why some weapons vanish completely, while others linger. Not because one is superior, but because one remains connected to a living system. The composite bow survived for thousands of years because it fit perfectly into the culture that used it. Steppe societies depended on mounted archery. The bow was not just a weapon, it was part of identity, part of daily life. When firearms eventually replaced it, the change was not immediate. It took generations, and in some places the bow remained in use alongside guns, not because it was better, but because it was familiar, reliable, and understood. The repeating crossbow survived for similar reasons. It filled a niche, required modest training, and could be produced consistently. It was never the most powerful weapon on the field, but it was dependable. And sometimes dependability matters more than raw power. Other technologies were less fortunate. Greek fire depended on secrecy and centralized production. When that system collapsed, there was no distributed knowledge to preserve it. The formula died not because it was impossible to recreate, but because no one had enough information left to attempt it. Damascus steel depended on specific materials, specific techniques, and specific traditions of forging. Remove any of those, and the chain breaks. Without the original ore, without the accumulated experience of generations of smiths, the process became guesswork. And guesswork is rarely enough to rebuild a lost craft. There is another pattern hidden in these stories, one that is easy to overlook. Ancient craftsmen did not think in terms of chemistry or physics as we do today. They did not calculate carbon percentages or analyze crystal structures. They learned by watching, by feeling, by repeating actions until patterns emerged. Knowledge lived in the senses. The color of heated metal, the sound of a hammer strike, the smell of a forge at the right temperature, the tension in a bowstring drawn to its limit. These were measurements, even if they were never written down as numbers. Modern science often rediscovers principles that craftsmen learned long ago through experience. The difference is not necessarily in capability, but in language. We describe phenomena with equations. They described them with practice, and sometimes practice alone was enough to reach astonishing levels of precision. Consider the smith forging a flexible blade that must bend without breaking. He may not know the word martensite, but he knows the exact shade of red that tells him the steel is ready. He knows how long to quench, how long to temper, when to stop. The knowledge exists, even if the terminology does not. And when such knowledge is lost, it is not easily recovered, because it was never fully written down. There is also a human element to all of this, one that is often overlooked. Innovation does not always come from grand institutions or organized research. Sometimes it comes from individuals, craftsmen, engineers, inventors, working in isolation, solving problems that matter deeply to them. Archimedes defending his city, an unknown smith perfecting a blade, engineers designing a rocket launcher to protect their homeland, bowyers refining a weapon generation after generation until it reached perfection. History remembers some names and forgets others, but behind every artifact is a person who understood something others did not, and sometimes that understanding dies with them. There is a tendency in the modern world to see history as a ladder, each generation climbing higher than the last. In many ways, that is true. We have technologies that ancient societies could scarcely imagine: satellites, computers, machines that can peer into the structure of atoms. But progress is not a straight line. It is a landscape of peaks and valleys. Some knowledge rises, then falls. Some discoveries are made, forgotten, and rediscovered centuries later. Concrete strong enough to withstand seawater, perfected by Roman engineers, and lost for over 1,000 years. Techniques of navigation that vanished when trade routes collapsed. Architectural methods that modern builders still struggle to replicate exactly. Weapons are simply the most dramatic examples because their purpose was so immediate, so tied to survival. They remind us that the past was not a world of ignorance slowly groping toward enlightenment. It was a world of skilled people, solving difficult problems with the tools they had, sometimes achieving results that still command respect today. If there is one lesson to take from all these stories, it is not that ancient civilizations possessed secret knowledge beyond our comprehension. It is something both simpler and more profound. Human ingenuity has always been powerful. Human memory has always been fragile. What we know today exists because countless chains of knowledge remained unbroken. What we do not know often vanished, not because it was impossible, but because history erased the people who knew it. Somewhere, in forgotten workshops and abandoned forges, there were techniques and insights that died without witnesses, ideas that worked, methods that were refined, skills that were once as common as breathing within a small circle of craftsmen, and are now gone. And yet, the artifacts remain, a blade that bends without breaking, a mechanism that fires again and again, a fragment of metal that once fell from the sky, a weapon that turned the sea itself into fire. They are quiet now, resting in museums or buried in earth, but they carry a message that survives long after the civilizations that created them. The past was not simple, the past was not primitive, and the line between what we understand and what we have forgotten is far thinner than we like to believe.